those are the main anxiety disorders. Okay. Now, like I said, anxiety disorders are caused by an overactivation of the flight or fight response, the stress response, the sympathetic nervous system. It's all the same thing. And it manifests itself in all these various ways. Now, a lot of people think depersonalization disorder is an anxiety disorder. Okay, now why is that? Because in depersonalization disorder, you'll see panic attacks. People are worried about a lot of things, existential fears. They're also obsessive, okay? Uh, Depersonalization is actually, a lot of people say, related to obsessive compulsive disorder, which it absolutely is. And it's in the obsessive compulsive spectrum, meaning people with depersonalization constantly obsess about themselves, their thoughts, and their symptoms. Okay, so they're constantly thinking about it. And OCD and DP involve similar brain regions. Okay, so OCD is actually kind of a little bit different from a neurological standpoint from the other anxiety disorders in that regard. It involves this sort of, there's an OCD loop in the brain, and DP really shares that. Okay, so depersonalization is related to OCD because it involves similar brain pathways. Now, depersonalization also involves panic attacks many times. The classic way people get depersonalization is through a panic attack. A marijuana-induced panic attack is very common. Someone will smoke marijuana, have a panic attack, and then develop chronic depersonalization in an acute manner through that. Okay, so depersonalization oftentimes involves future panic attacks, which tend to increase the symptoms of derealization and depersonalization, a sense of detachment from the self and a sense of detachment from the outside situation. So clearly, panic is involved in depersonalization as well as obsessiveness, similar to OCD, and similar to a certain kind of OCD called purely obsessive OCD, which doesn't involve compulsions. And really, every anxiety disorder is extremely co-occurring with depersonalization, with the exception of PTSD. Okay, so really, depersonalization and anxiety blend quite a bit. There's a lot of overlap. But depersonalization is not simply an anxiety disorder, though it has many anxiety-related traits. Depersonalization is a dissociative disorder. Okay, so it lies on the dissociative spectrum of disorders, including borderline personality disorder, and on the very extreme end, dissociative identity disorder, also known previously as multiple personality disorder. Okay, so all these disorders are related on the dissociative spectrum, and they originate in trauma in the early years of a person's life. Okay, specifically disorganized attachment style and dysfunctional families and invalidating circumstances in a person's youth. Chronic stress, chronic, accumulated trauma. And that's what a dissociative disorder is. It's a way, it develops because it's a way for a person to cut off from accumulated pain. And that's very different from simply an anxiety disorder. Okay, because an anxiety disorder doesn't involve that. So, interestingly, anxiety, one symptom of anxiety is transient depersonalization and transient derealization. So detachment from the self and a sense of unreality can occur in anxiety, especially after panic attacks, but it usually goes away and isn't chronic. So that's another difference between anxiety and depersonalization disorder. So the particular kind of invalidating adolescent and childhood circumstance that people with depersonalization disorder have experienced is emotional abuse. Okay, emotional abuse is highly, highly correlated with developing depersonalization disorder later in life. Now, with the other dissociative disorders, abuse tends to be more severe, especially in dissociative identity disorder. Those people tend to have experienced physical and sexual abuse. That's why their personalities literally split apart. In depersonalization, there's a sense of detachment from the self, but it's more mild, and it's caused primarily by emotional abuse. Now, anxiety disorders often are partially caused by emotional abuse, but they're not grounded necessarily in disorganized attachment styles, which I talk about in other videos. Okay, whereas dissociative disorders are. And emotional abuse is at the root of depersonalization disorder. Now, emotional abuse sufferers often don't know that they've suffered emotional abuse, and they oftentimes just blame themselves, okay? So emotional abuse sufferers often experience a global sense of guilt, depression, low self-esteem, submissiveness, panic attacks, anxiety, uncontrollable anger that arises seemingly from nowhere, and an inclination towards addictive behaviors, uh, psychosomatic problems such as chronic back pain, irritable bowel syndrome, migraines. And people that have these symptoms of emotional abuse are usually clueless as to why they suffer all this pain, why their lives are so painful. And it's because emotional abuse is so subtle. And emotional abuse is an extremely common form of parental neglect, and it's at the root of depersonalization disorder. Okay, so that is really the key element in DPD. As well, people with depersonalization have a wounded sense of self, and they have a part of themselves that they have pushed out of their awareness because it causes pain. There's a stigma associated with some part of themselves, and this is all related to emotional abuse. And in anxiety disorders, there is a lot of times emotional abuse, but not to the same degree as DP, and it doesn't involve disorganized attachment. So I know that's kind of confusing, but depersonalization disorder is a dissociative disorder that also has anxiety-related traits.